Welcome to R&R Live and Life. In this episode, Rick and I head to Steep Point, a headland at the mouth of South Passage and fronts the Indian Ocean, the most westerly point of Australia, so that we could tick off another bucket list item. We left Hamlin Pool just after sunrise. It was interesting to watch the moon as it sunk lower towards the Indian Ocean, especially with such a clear blue sky. The clouds that came in later made for some interesting pictures, resulting in the inlets changing colour from one bay to the next, and creating the scenery to switch between dark and light with the passing cloud cover. The light showers also gave us a rainbow. What a magical sight. The first 60 kilometres was bitumen on the eastern side of the peninsula, up until we started on the Useless Loop Road at the bottom of Useless Inlet. There were a few small patches of bitumen, but the majority was a corrugated unsealed road. Work had been carried out at some point to improve the conditions of the road, but corrugated sections had formed in this 140 kilometre section of the road before we tackled the last 30 kilometres, a soft single lane track winding around the sand dunes. Yes, I did say tackle the road, because there is no other word for it. It took us near on 9 hours to travel there and back, through some of the most stunning and incredibly beautiful country we have seen to date, and over some of the most corrugated roads we have travelled. But it was worth it. We have lived in rural areas where the roads leave a lot to be desired, but this was more a case of travellers not driving to conditions and creating corrugations. Why people feel the need to attack the road instead of driving to the conditions is hard for me to understand, when all it does is do damage to the road and the vehicle in the long run. We have spent years driving on dirt roads, and Rick enjoys driving it. Soft sand? Well, that can be a challenge, but one that we are experienced enough to travel. We drove at a reasonable speed so as to minimise the corrugation impact, as travelling any faster was just too rough, and the bonus was that I got to take more photographs. Snap happy, some would say. That is, until I have to cull and compare to make this episode. The photos were taken as we travelled, except for a few stationary ones taken at Steep Point. I have sat and sifted through over 1,000 photographs to put together this episode, and it has made me want to return, though by the end of that day I had been ready to make a move onto less rough roads. It was an incredible day. I remember saying at one point, "Are we there yet?" 3 hours in, and the sign to Steep Point was saying 47 kilometres to go. And unbeknown to us, the worst was yet to come. I've included a lot of road photos to give some indication of the conditions and where the road disappeared to in places, so remote and isolated, but we did come prepared for unforeseen happenings. The first part of the trip had been undulating bitumen with straight sections between rises. The vegetation changed as we dipped down into the flatter sections between the rises. We passed Tamala Homestead, located on the southern end of Shark Bay World Heritage Area. The gravel road wasn't too bad, as it had recently been graded. The property is still an active pastoral holding, operating since the late 1880s, with the limestone homestead constructed in 1896. Directly north of the homestead was Prickly Point, but due to an Indigenous Land Use Agreement application, the camping areas are closed until further notice. On the driver's side were inlets of the Henri Freycinet Harbour, then the Useless Inlet and Blind Strait, before reaching the point. On the passenger side, west towards the Zertoff Cliffs, was mainly sand dune country, backed by more sand dunes covered in heath. It was really interesting to see the changing scenery out both windows. Once we turned off the Useless Loop Road at the tip of Blind Strait, we passed secluded bays, salt pans, scrub-covered dunes, and glimpses of Dirk Hartog Island, passing the turn-off to the blowholes at Thunder Point. There is a town, Useless Loop, a closed community for the employees and their families of the solar salt operation Shark Bay. At the registration station, we lowered our tyre pressure before tackling the last 30 kilometres. As we entered this section of the track became very soft with a long, steep hill climb. Just the first of many dunes we were to cross before reaching Steep Point. The road narrowed to become a rugged sand track, switching between very soft sand to relatively soft, up and over massive sand dunes, and in places the vegetation hugged the road. At the registration point we passed part of the flume for the Shark Bay salt field that was built in 1962, with shipments of salt beginning in 1967. Located in the middle of Shark Bay World Heritage Area, it encompasses about 130 square kilometres, of which 70 square kilometres are operational ponds, and is closed to the south end of Shark Bay. The seawater salinity here is about 50% more than the open sea. The salt field was built by enclosing natural inlets with salt water fed into the first evaporation ponds in the Useless Inlet area, containing about 64 square kilometres of evaporation ponds, using the movement of tides, with the concentrated brine from the Useless Inlet area transferred to the Useless Loop area through a 20-kilometre long flume. The Useless Loop area has 37 crystalliser ponds in various sizes and shapes, a salt washing plant, a stockpile area, and its own loading port. The operation was not visible from the road, only the crystalliser or evaporation pools in the flume. The last 30 kilometres through the proposed Edel Land National Park to Steep Point was slow going, but fascinating. Massive windswept sand dunes, followed by patches of thick vegetation, not to mention the goats, being the only animals we saw. With about 7 kilometres to go, we passed the turn-off to Shelter Bay, the main camp on Steep Point, with its white sandy beaches looking out into the protected waters of South Passage, and further out to Dirk Hartog Island. We hugged the coastline in places, and were happy it was low tide, before the sandy track gave way to rocky limestone as we climbed the headland to Steep Point. On arriving at Steep Point, we were rewarded with very exposed rocky cliffs, with a south-westerly wind, though not keeping the flies at bay, and Dirk Hartog Island National Park, where we could see the spray against the cliffs along the coastline. We had passed some of the most spectacular coastal landforms, with many bays and inlets, even along the edge of the water in a couple of places. To be at such a remote and isolated spot was thrilling, but gratifying, something I will cherish for years to come. Just under the cliffs at Steep Point was the Oven campsite, with a magnificent outlook, but without a sandy beach, and I think I would have to choose favourable weather conditions to camp on this exposed rocky site. Maybe a fisherman's paradise. We chose not to follow the 20-kilometre track along the Zertoff Cliffs along the western edge of the proposed Edeland National Park. The cliffs run as far south as Kalbarri. Popular for the towering cliffs that rise up to 200 metres out of the Indian Ocean and the many blowholes at False Entrance and just north of Thunder Bay, it wasn't for us this trip. What a stunning adventure, with the return trip just as stunning as the trip out, and passing 15 cars travelling in the opposite direction. Seeing it at an alternate angle, the time of day, and with the clouds coming and going, gave us a different perspective. Western Australia has history so different from the eastern states, with the earliest European exploration of the region by the Dutch explorer Dirk Hartog in 1616, when he landed on Cape Inscription on what is now named Dirk Hartog Island. Hartog was the first recorded European to land on the western coastline of Australia, and he was followed by many others, including de Vlaminga in 1697, who was a Dutch seafarer that named the headland Steep Point when anchored off the cliffs near the southern tip of Dirk Hartog Island, while William Dampier, on his second voyage to Australia, named Shark Bay in 1699, apparently because he felt that the area was infested by them, although he may have mistaken the local dolphins for sharks, marking the beginning of several explorations by the Dutch, French and English. In 1772, St. Aleron claimed the western half of New Holland for France, but he died in Mauritius without reaching France and having his claim confirmed. Henry Mangles Denham surveyed the area in 1858, producing charts that were used into the 1960s. Settlement followed these voyages of discovery. Guano was stripped from Shark Bay Islands around 1850. Pearling started about the same time and continued into the 1930s, when the shells were depleted through overfishing. Sheep was introduced in the 1860s, and the pastoral industry has been through good times and droughts ever since then. Some pastoral stations have become conservation areas in recent years. Sandalwood was cut from the 1890s until 2000, but fishing was the area's economic mainstay for the early 20th century. In the 21st century, pearling is making a comeback through pearl farming. Shark Bay World Heritage Area extends from the mainland into the Indian Ocean as a large peninsula with several large islands and mudflats. Declared a World Heritage Area in 1991, being one of 14 places in the world where you can see major stages in the Earth's evolution, ongoing ecological processes, unique natural phenomena and significant natural habitats where endangered species of animals and plants reside. Both Shark Bay Marine Park and Hamlin Pool Marine Nature Reserve lie within the Shark Bay World Heritage Area, valued internationally for its rich and abundant marine life and spectacular scenery where the desert meets the sea. Covering over 4,000 square kilometres, with over 70% being marine, the seagrass meadows, the largest seagrass bed in the world, are the foundation of Shark Bay marine ecosystems, providing shelter and food for hundreds of species, from mollusks and crustaceans to fish and sea snakes, not to mention the Earth's oldest living life forms, the stromatolites. Seagrasses also create unusual salinity gradients by trapping sediment and building sills that restrict water flow. This iconic and valuable marine ecosystem is under serious threat, as it is especially vulnerable to future climate change, given that the temperate seagrass that underpins the entire ecosystem is already living at the upper edge of its acceptable temperature range. The proposed Edelin National Park extends from Steep Point in the north to just south of False Entrance, named because of the many early mariners who mistook it for the entrance to Shark Bay between Steep Point and Dirk Hartog Island, and encompasses much of Bellefonte Prong, with its contrasting coastlines of tall rugged cliffs, sweeping white sand and crescent-shaped secluded beaches that form the western boundary of Shark Bay. This dry and windswept limestone coast hosts resilient plant and animal life, set against waters teeming with marine life. Dirk Hartog Island is situated in the World Heritage listed Shark Bay, is about 80 kilometres long and between 3 and 15 kilometres wide, and is Western Australia's largest and westerly island, covering an area of 620 square kilometres and being one of the most historic and pristine locations in Western Australia. It is also home to the last iconic sunset in Australia, as the sun sets over the Indian Ocean. The island is now the site of a major environmental reconstruction project that has seen all introduced livestock and feral animals removed, and 11 native species in various stages of reintroduction. Dirk Hartog first sighted the island in 1616, but it wasn't until 1772 when Louis St. Alruin landed on the island and formally took possession of it in the name of the French King Louis XV. Since then, many explorers have landed on the island, often leaving reminders of their visit. In 1869, Francis von Bilbra was granted a lease to the island, where he grazed sheep and traded guano from its bays. Since that first lease was granted, many owners have lived and worked on the island producing wool, before it became a private retreat in about 1969. With the exception of the pastoral homestead, the island later returned to government ownership and became part of the Shark Bay Marine Park. The homestead is now run as an eco-tourist resort. The northerlymost point, Cape Inscription, is the location of the plates, a recording of visits made by explorers to the area, and the main lighthouse. The bay facing north next to Cape Inscription is known as Turtle Bay, with the most southwesterly point, Surf Point, located at the channel known as South Passage, across from Steep Point. On our way into Hamlin Pool, we had passed the Overlander Roadhouse, a family-operated business situated at the turn-off to Shark Bay. The Roadhouse is a fully self-sufficient operation, providing and generating its own electricity and water, and all sewage and general waste is dealt with on site. While at Hamlin Pool, they did produce their own electricity and provided salty water for showering and the toilets, but we were self-contained, taking our grey water and general waste with us when we left, as you would in such a pristine environment. At the Overlander, the fresh food and all other stock is road freighted to the Roadhouse from Geraldton or Perth, with most of the fuel currently supplied from Perth. The freight costs involved in stocking and running the Roadhouse would be astronomical. Having lived in remote areas of Queensland and the Northern Territory for many years, it has given us some indication as to what it would be like living here at the Overlander. I take my hat off to them. What an interesting day Rick and I have had. There are some places we have visited that are remarkable, if not outstanding, and this was one of them. One we will treasure for a long, long time. Even though I have struggled with choosing photos to include, it has been a wonderful experience revisiting the trip. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Give us a thumbs up if you did. Join us next time when we move on to Shell Beach Conservation Park and Denham. Take care and stay safe. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary. R&R Living Life.